you have a Bible, everybody?
Yes.
So we're looking at the story of the prodigal son, the parable in Luke 15.
Right.
It starts at verse 11. There was a man who had two sons. So we spent the whole hour last time looking at this parable, and we said there's more to say about it. So we're going to spend some more time today. I want to start this way, though. Can somebody just, without looking, just briefly tell the story? Just the basic story. What happens in the story of the prodigal son? Somebody care to just say what the story is? You heard this story all your life, right? Probably.
The characters are the father and two sons. Both the younger of the two sons is dissatisfied, and he requests the father's his share, what he considers his share of his father's wealth. And he goes off, leaves the family, and goes off into a wicked way of life, and ruins the money and doesn't have anything. He's eating out of pigsties, and he hits rock bottom and considers going back home and decides to do so. He gets pretty close to the house, and the father sees him coming and is overjoyed that he's returning. However, after he gets all this wonderful celebration and welcoming, his older brother is the dissatisfied one, and he is very unhappy about the welcome that the younger one has gotten because of his actions. And that's pretty much the story. Okay,
very good. All right, so you got all the main characters and the main pieces of action. Good. I'd like you to, if you got a pen and a piece of paper, write down an answer to this question. Write down an answer to this question. Why does the young man end up starving in the pig pen? Why does the young man end up starving in the pig pen?
I don't know.
Everybody think you got an answer to that question? You can nod your head yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Then why don't I call on some people, and we'll and maybe you'd be willing to share your answer, and I'll just jot them down. I'm going to start with Patricia because you told the story.
I wrote that he spent all he had on sinful life, and he has no more money to do anything but starve.
Okay. Pat Drazer, what did you write?
Well, it's true what Pat said, but the other thing is he wasn't allowed to eat the pork. It was against his religion to eat, Jewish people to eat the pork. So he couldn't even, I don't know what they fed the pigs, but he wasn't able to eat that or anything else I guess they served.
Okay. Joyce Moore, do you have a thought?
Well, I said almost what Pat said, that he had spent all his money on frivolous things, and then when it came to buying food, he had no money left.
Okay, spent all he had, none left. Okay, Caroline? What do you think, Carolyn?
Carolyn?
Carolyn.
Carol.
Yeah, Carol.
Carolyn. I have basically it is the same, but I was wondering if he wasn't allowed to do this before he ran away. And now he's, thinking that he can spend and spend and spend. He didn't have access to all that money, and now he does, and he just went and spent it all.
Okay, all right. Yeah, not only did he spend it all, he had a lot to spend. So he kind of like sowing his oats out there, right? Something like that.
Before that, when he lived with his father, maybe he wasn't able to learn how to spend his money or not spend his money.
Ah, okay. All right. That he had all of this is new for him.
Yeah, that's what I think. I don't.
Okay, all right. Okay. Campeses? Joe and Judy?
Say something first?
You can go first.
I agreed with everything. I said he spent everything he had. He is prodigal, which means spending everything you have. But there was also a famine that happened.
Right.
So that made it worse for him.
Okay.
I was going to say that he's in a distant land. He's not in his own country. He's in a foreign land. He's a foreigner. He maybe certainly wasn't welcomed wherever he was, even though he thought he could. So nobody cared about him.
Good. Okay. All right. Carol Devoti?
Well, I wrote, I guess he had trouble getting a job, or even if he was looking for one, but he wasn't working properly. He wasn't doing his job the way he was supposed to. And that's why they didn't pay him, or he didn't get paid for his labors.
Okay. All right. Ginny, do you have a thought?
Yeah, yes, I wrote down that he foolishly spent the money and didn't realize that it was pretty soon it was practically nothing there.
All right. Foolishly spent. There's a bit of a judgment upon him then too. He's acting foolishly. Good. Let's see. Annabelle, do you have a thought?
Well, I agree with everything, but I was thinking it was more the famine than anything that kept him from eating.
Okay. Yep. Mentioned the famine as well.
And there was no work because the land was dry and couldn't plant.
Yeah. And Pastor Rebecca, I've saved you for last.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, all that you guys said is great. My thought was possibly this young man never learned money management. He
Yeah,
never learned, he was never able to be independent, how to make his own decisions. He was always kind of just did what his father told him to do. He went out, he worked, he lived at home, and he never had to worry about anything. And so I don't know if he didn't go to school or didn't learn these things, I don't really know, but it seems as if he just kind of assumed somehow that if he had a lot of money, he'd be good. And that's all he needed. And he was counting on the money to buy him happiness. And it also bought him friends for a while until the money ran out. And then he realized, again, due to his naivete, whatever you want to call it, that the friends were not real friends. They were only in it because he was buying them stuff and he was treating them to fun stuff. And so they hung around. And as soon as the money ran out, they ran out too.
Yeah.
And so I think it was a whole like life learning, a whole growing up situation for him. And again, he had no other skills than what he had done to fall back on. And he had no support system. So he kind of was stuck doing just whatever he could desperately do to just try to scratch something together. And it didn't turn out to be enough.
Good. All right, so we got a good kind of a good smattering of a range of responses here. A couple of you mentioned the famine, but most of you didn't. His spending ways and even his foolishness comes to the fore. I was really moved in understanding this story in a new way a few years ago when I heard Mark Powell, who teaches Bible at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Ohio, talk about this from his experience as a teacher. He did an experiment. He's an expert in reading the scriptures, and he's learned about what he calls social location, that people in different parts of the world and with different life experiences read Bible stories perhaps differently. And so the common idea is that, you know, women might read and understand texts differently than men, that Lutherans might read texts differently than Presbyterians or Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, that people of different races or of different countries might hear and read different details in a story. So it's a common, there's not anything too remarkable about saying this idea about interpreting texts. So Powell did this experiment. He took 100 of his seminary students and he asked them to do what I did right at the very beginning, just tell the story. And he kind of recorded how they told the story without looking at it. He was surprised that only 6 out of 100 mentioned the famine, even though it's a detail in the story in verse 14. It's right there, part of the story, but only 6 of his seminary students had even noted that detail when they tell the story. All of them note things like about the boy's character, how foolish he was, that he wasn't wise enough to keep a large amount of money from falling through his hands, and he just spent it all. He was wasteful. The attitudes that some of you mentioned about being foolish came to the fore. So that we see in the story, he really has an important, at the turning point of the story is he comes to himself, it says, and he goes home repentant. He goes home very sorrowful about what he's done, and he's pleading to be welcomed back into his father's household, even as a servant now. I'm not worthy to be called your son, but treat me as one of your slaves. This is the speech that he rehearses to himself. He's never able to get that all out. But in any case, Powell's students, all American seminary students, only 6% noted the famine, which is really could also be seen as a key factor in why he ends up starving in the pig pen. Powell was intrigued by that why is there this, why do we let details of stories like this drop out? And so he wanted to test the hypothesis and said maybe it has something to do with they all come from this kind of similar background. They're all American seminary students. And he had an opportunity, he had a sabbatical in St. Petersburg, Russia. And while he was there, he said, I'm going to test this out. And he was only able to get 50 students together at a time, but he ran the same experiment. He asked them to tell the story. And he was surprised that 42 out of the 50 mentioned the famine. 42 out of 50. So that's 84%. Now, why would 84% of students in St. Petersburg, Russia remember that detail, and only 6% of Americans remember that detail? Here's what he says about it. I'll just read a paragraph from the book Powell wrote describing this after I heard it in a lecture. Aren't we supposed to think that the boy did something wrong? He asked the Russian students. Of course, they told me, but the boy's mistake was not how he spent his money or how he lost it. His mistake was leaving his father's house in the first place. His sin was placing a price tag on the value of his family, thinking that money was all he needed from them. Once he had his share of the family fortune, the family itself no longer mattered. His sin was wanting to be self-sufficient, not being wasteful, not being foolish, but wanting to be self-sufficient. This is the Russians' understanding. I told them about the American students, and this prompted further discussion. How revealing, they said, that the Americans think that the great sin was wasting money. They think this because money is very important to them in America. In a capitalist country, it must be a very bad thing to squander one's inheritance. But here in the socialist state, the sin is self-sufficiency. This boy's sin was that he wanted to make it in the world on his own. He trusted in his finances and his own sense of going it alone. And he figured out that that would be enough to get by. And who knows, he might have made it if not for the famine. But that's what happened, Jesus says. Famines do come. In a world where there are famines and things like factory closings and automobile accidents and medical emergencies and viruses, yeah, pandemics.
Yeah.
Only a fool would want to be alone. That's the Russians' idea. He was intrigued, Powell was, a little bit more about this famine. And so he asked more about, well, why would that word in the story connect with these folks in a way that perhaps it didn't with Americans? Remember where he was? He was in St. Petersburg, Russia. So he learned a little bit about the history of St. Petersburg. Here's what he writes. In 1941, the German army laid siege to the city of Petersburg. It was then called Leningrad, subjected its inhabitants to what was, in effect, a 900-day famine.
Wow.
During that time, 670,000 people died of starvation and exposure, about 1/4 of the total population. This is a major event in World War II. Some of the current inhabitants of the city, Powell was there talking to these students right around 2002. Some of the current inhabitants of the city are survivors still of that horror from 1941. Even more are descendants of the survivors. Other residents represent a whole new generation of immigrants, but even for them, a collective memory remains strong in the cultural milieu. In modern St. Petersburg, typical social issues, things like care of the elderly, imprisonment of lawbreakers, socialized medicine, they are often considered through the lens of one important question. What if there's not enough food? Russian students and Russians in general who might remember the events of their parents or grandparents have this kind of embedded into their life in a way that at least Powell's American students who'd never experienced this kind of famine. Now, American students might come from families where their parents and grandparents, great-grandparents might have experienced the Great Depression. And that had a powerful cultural impact on students and on American society as well. But can you imagine 670,000 people dying in about 2 or 3 years? It was about a 3-year period during the war. That kind of experience has embedded in them maybe a sensitivity to a word like famine when it shows up in a story. It's a very intriguing detail. I mean, I was just amazed at this kind of how social location makes a difference in how we read a story. That's really Powell's point. He did one more experiment because he had an opportunity to go to Tanzania in Africa. And there, he said, wow, this will be great. I can test this hypothesis about how social location might make a difference of how people read this story. So he gathered again about 50 theology students in Tanzania, where he was teaching for a semester. And he asked them the question that I asked you: why does this man end up starving in the pig pen? It says, I was curious to see how many would write because he wasted his money, and how many would write because there was a famine. Those seem to be the two choices, right? Americans said one thing, Russians said another. What would the Tanzanians say? A few did write responses like that, but the vast majority, around 80%, wrote something completely different. They wrote, because nobody gave him anything to eat. Now, Paul says that wasn't even an option that I had given them. I was thinking in terms of one way or the other. But if you check the story in Luke 15, it actually does say that. If you look at now at Luke 15, starting at verse 13. We'll just read
Verse 16, yeah.
We're just going to read a few verses. Started for 13. A few days later, the young son gathered all he had, traveled to a distant country. There he squandered his property in dissolute living. So that's the thing that the American students keyed in on, right? And most of you did too. He wasted his property, wasted his money, right? When he had spent everything, this is verse 14, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. He began to be in need when the famine hit. This is what the Russian students saw. Verse 15. So he went and hired him out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would have gladly filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. This is what the Tanzanian students heard and focused on. Why does he end up in such a poor state? Because he's helpless and nobody is helping him, because nobody will give him anything to eat. In other words, all three of the answers come right out of the text, right out of the story. People aren't not speculating. They're not trying to make up or adding some details. They're reading the story, but they're hearing it perhaps a little differently. Now, why Paul adds a little bit, writes a little bit more about the Tanzanians and their response. I pressed the matter with them. I asked, why should anyone give him anything? Wasn't it his own fault, squandering his money like that? They told me, Professor Powell, that's a very callous perspective. How American of you, they said. The boy was in, as Joe mentioned, the boy was in a far country. Immigrants often lose their money. They don't know how things work. They might spend all of their money when they shouldn't because they don't know about when the famines come. People think they're fools just because they don't know how to live in that country, but the Bible commands us to take care of the stranger and the alien in our midst. It's a lack of hospitality not to do so. This story the Tanzanians told me is less about personal repentance than it is about society. Specifically, it is about the kingdom of God. It contrasts the Father's house with the far country. The Father's house is the kingdom of God that Jesus keeps talking about. But the far country is that society without honor. Everyone who heard this parable would be shocked by his depiction of such a society, a country that would let a stranger go hungry and not give him anything to eat. The central point of the parable is the scribes and the Pharisees are just like that. Jesus tells this as a parable in response to the scribes and the Pharisees who are grumbling that he welcomes sinners and eats with them. The parable teaches that the kingdom of God is a society that welcomes the undeserving, and it puts the scribes and the Pharisees to shame by showing that they are like a society with no honor, that shows no hospitality to the stranger in their midst. I've really been moved by these three different answers by three different groups of, because I was one of those students once, right? I went to seminary, but I'm convicted by this notion that I read these stories through the lens of how I was brought up, or how I was taught to understand them. And there are multiple ways. It's really an example of, we should walk in another person's shoes before we make judgments about them, especially when the text has multiple pieces in there. And if we just read them perhaps more slowly, perhaps more carefully, we might see a different perspective. Tanzanians have something to teach us. Russians have something to teach us, Americans. When we fixate on the money side of things, for example, and miss the cultural and the society responses for a person who is destitute, for somebody who is in real dire straits. Our current crisis, this pandemic, if we can try and relate it to that, it's not a famine, but it certainly is a disaster. And it is showing the clear divisions and distinctions in our culture and in our society. How is it that Black and brown people are dying at much, much higher rates than white Americans? How is it that the poor of our communities are having so much a tougher time? When early on we called this the great equalizer, that the virus doesn't care if you're wealthy or not, it doesn't care what race you are. If you're human, you can catch this disease. And yet we know the disease is impacting communities very, very differently. Every day now, there's an article in the newspaper about these differences. This morning, highlighting the differences in the Bronx. Those kinds of differences get teased out when we try to read a story from 2,000 years ago that Rabbi Jesus used to talk about the scribes and the Pharisees and the poor in his midst. And I think this is a good example for all of us to read all of these stories, to try and hear the different perspectives that come from around the room, from within our group, from our own experiences, but then also to try and hear sometimes those from very different cultures and very different life experiences than we've known as well. Paul's book he's written this up in a book about, for preachers, about preaching. And he's talking specifically about how pastors sometimes miss the gap between their experience and the experience of people in the pew. And he uses this as an example to help us see what those gaps can really look like, using a story that everybody knows, that is really common. Along with the Good Samaritan, this story is probably among the most famous of all the stories that Jesus ever told. And it can be good for us to spend this extra time on this parable. So let me stop there and see, again, thoughts or reactions to what this has been, what I've shared today about this parable.
I was going to say, when you were talking about the, everything is context, like even the stories that Jesus told was for the context of the time. He knew what the Pharisees would understand when he was telling these stories, and the local people. That's why a lot of our stories we talk about that are shepherds and things that we necessarily maybe don't understand, but they would have understood about inheritance and these kind of things that maybe we don't. But just when you're talking about the differences in the Americans, the Russians, and the Tanzanians, one of my thoughts went to a typical American response is you hear the first thing and you fixate on that. And the first thing was the money. And then you kind of start your mind going and your reaction to that, and you don't maybe
Maybe.
necessarily listen to the rest of some of the details. You already are a step ahead thinking about it. And the other thing being a very American thing that I should know how to take care of myself, whereas opposed to
Yeah.
Tanzanian, where if you do good, I do good, like the Ubuntu. Like if it's good for me, it's good for you. If it's good for you, it's good for me. Not the, well, every man for himself, that sometimes becomes, unfortunately, an American goal, or, like everyone, that's how we judge people on their success, right? How well they
Yeah.
can do for themselves, not, and it speaks to our society. And sadly, like you said, it is coming full circle now as we look at what's happening, where those communities that could not do for themselves or didn't have access are not faring well. And communities such as some of our immigrant communities, where culturally they live with extended family, with, they don't just have one or two people in a house, they have maybe 2-3 families. So when you talk socially distance, it's not possible to do that with, maybe 10 people living in a house, as opposed to 2 people. If someone gets sick, everybody's going to get sick because there's nowhere to go. And also their, whatever, access to healthcare, that, all that, and the jobs they have to do put them at risk. For some people.
The story in the paper this morning about the Bronx was that describing how the virus is infecting some high rises there. So just going out of your apartment onto an elevator
to get your mail,
it might not be disinfected, or how many people do you have to ride that elevator with every day? So you can't socially isolate yourself the same way that we here in suburbia can.
Exactly. People that have to take public transportation, people that,
Yeah. Joe, go ahead.
There's, I was a teacher before I was a police officer.
Yeah.
And I noticed that I taught in an elementary school in Bushwick back in the 70s. And they weren't used to seeing a white male teaching, because many teachers were female. And it was a mixed group of people. But you're right, that perspective is so different, because what I remember growing up in grammar school was mostly all white kids with nuns and stuff, and very strict. And when you try to do those things in that kind of a neighborhood, it doesn't work. But there's other things too that the Bronx, you mentioned the Bronx. I mean, there are similar neighborhoods that this has been going on and on for a long time.
Yeah,
and I think this is what it troubles me, because what's the big difference between, back, Jimmy Carter was going to make a big thing back, and I don't want to be political, but a big thing back in the Bronx, fix the place up and pour money in. But it never seems to change. It's still going on. I don't know what I'm trying to say is that there will always be this, I think, no matter what. These developments are now used to be called projects. It's extremely population intense there. And it's a hotbed anytime that we would patrol that area. It was horrible. I don't know.
Part of it, I was just going to say, you said it'll always go on. It'll always go on as long as we accept it, as long as we allow it to go on. And I think that's, like the Tanzanian results. Well, how could it, like, shame on you for not extending hospitality, for accepting that was okay, that no one would help him.
But I think there are many things that they do. Things are extended to these locations, and I don't know what changes. I
think it's a systemic thing. It's not per location. It's a lot of things involved, but part of it is many people came here to America for freedoms, to be on our own, to be independent, and that's been and unfortunately, we've maybe, lost some of that more care for our neighbor, I have enough, let's make sure everyone else has enough type of a spirit. It's just not our American DNA as much as it is other places.
Yeah, I think just in terms of demographics and social policy and building ideas, in the 1950s and 1960s, it seemed to make sense to build high rises and with lots of high density housing. It seemed an efficient way that you could get a lot of people to live in a small area and build community, right? I think now we're seeing some of the problems with that kind of those kinds of buildings when a disease can run rampant through a 20-story building with 80 or 90 apartments and multiple generations living in small crowded spaces. Boy, it's so out of the realm of my own experience, my suburban experience. It's now it's probably too easy for people like me to say, well, we just shouldn't do that anymore. But goodness, how hard it will be to change and see things from a different perspective. Once again, I think the virus is putting that right in our consciousness now in some new ways that we didn't have even just a few weeks ago. But Joe certainly is right that we've known about some of these issues for a long, long time. And we can't expect them, we're not going to solve them overnight either. I do think the values that come out of a Bible study, though, the lessons that Jesus is seeking to teach with his parables can be brought forth to every generation and brought forth anew for every people. So that the way we read this story today, this is a new social location for us. The world has changed than it was even a few months ago for us. And we might just read this story and come out with different hopes and dreams for ourselves and for our neighbors.
Well, I mean, this story has a lot of, like, we talked about the perspective of where you live and what your priorities are and how your upbringing influenced the story, but it's also looking at the different characters in the story. I mean, there's other ways of looking at how if you were the father, how would you have experienced, if you just look at the passages about the father, because there's different societies would question why would he not punish the son? Why would he welcome him back? Why would he let him get more? If he thought that he took too much to begin with, why would you now welcome him back where he might be in the opportunity to get more from you? To think about how that, and why he was so free with his love and his forgiveness. Some might question that. We usually, when we tell the story with our American understanding, it's the, forgiveness of God and the grace overflowing that will forgive no matter how bad someone has wronged someone else. But it'd be interesting to see how other places view that. That would make an interesting story as well. Or the older son. What about him?
Yeah, we should talk about the older son a little bit too.
How does he, where is he in all this? He only pops in at the end when he finds out, and he's really jealous and annoyed that, hey, what about me? And again, is that our American understanding, reading in that, what about me? Or it's also the historical Jewish blessing of the oldest son, that he would have assumed his whole life. He's worked hard. He's been a loyal son. He's been there for his father. He should be assured that his retirement or that his future is assured because he's been there. He should get the big portion or what is there. And now if the father's already given some away, what has happened to his share? And why aren't his friends being celebrated? And why isn't he getting a party for being loyal? You know, the kid that ran away is the one that acted poorly, whether we say it's poor judgment or, you know, although I guess the Tanzanian spin on it, but then again, why wouldn't the older brother, if he knew that the younger son had been rejected and been hurt by those in another place that did not take care of him, one would have thought that he would have had compassion for his brother and said, yes, you're back with us, we'll take care of you. But that didn't seem to be the case here. So like, what's going on? You know, so there's many different ways to do the perspective in this story.
Yeah, especially as we bring in the older brother. And in fact, we can relate this to lots of other Bible stories too. And that can be a common way to read this story as a Cain and Abel story. Or as a story about, do you remember any other stories about brothers who treated one poorly?
About Joseph.
Yeah.
Joseph, Esau, Jacob and Esau.
There's a famine
Jacob-
for you
Jacob-
too. Joseph
And
had
there-
a
Jacob and Esau, right.
Yep.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
another stealing of an inheritance type of thing, you know,
Yep.
same
Yep.
type of it. It wasn't money, it was a blessing, but it was
The-
still a
the-
stolen inheritance.
Two stories from Genesis, Jacob and Esau and the Joseph story. The Joseph story has lots of parallels to this story. The boy going off to a far country, Joseph ends up in Egypt. A kind of reversal of fortunes. It's actually reversal
To
of
say it's the
fortunes.
opposite. Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Here the younger one makes out better.
And the
Joseph was,
wickedness is
Yeah.
between the brothers is the wicked part, not what they did. But Joseph was actually very welcomed and fared very well in his new position, but they were so jealous of
Right.
him that
Yeah.
they made things worse.
What does the older boy in the Prodigal Son story, what does he believe about his brother when he's come back? What does he believe that the younger brother has been doing all this time?
Living it up.
Yep. How does he put it?
How does he put it?
Yeah, what does he say? Well, we'll go back to the text. Look at verse 30.
He's been with prostitutes and living the, wanton life.
Yeah, where the heck does that come from?
That's probably what he would have done.
That's kind of out of left field here. There was no suggestion that the boy earlier was living it up with prostitutes. There was no kind of sexual immorality.
Well, in my Bible,
noted.
it says, but when this son of yours came, who has devoured your living with harlots.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So it's the older brother who brings that into the story.
The other brother is saying this to the father.
Yeah, it's the older brother, right.
That's what the younger brother did, and why should you?
Squandered your property with prostitutes. Right?
Squandered your property with prostitutes. Earlier on, when we were just looking at just the first part of the story, we noted the squandering part, the wasteful part, but there was no suggestion back then that there was some kind of immoral, sexual immoral relationship.
Well, it says dissolute, though. Dissolute living.
Yeah, dissolute living.
Kind of,
Could be a lot of things, yeah.
I guess they assume a single man is going to do that.
There you go. See,
Well, or like I said, that's
thank you,
what the
Carol.
elder brother had in his head that he would do if he ever got out and had a lot of money.
Yeah,
Yeah, lacks in morals. That's
yeah.
licentious. So
Yeah.
just
We might just draw this parallel with the Joseph story. You remember Joseph is sold off by his brothers into slavery, and his reversal is he becomes second in command and wealthy and powerful over in Egypt.
That's right, yeah.
He also was tempted by sexual immorality
Right.
in that story.
Potiphar, yeah.
By Potiphar. Potiphar's wife
Right.
tried to seduce him, and he shows the courage to say no. So there are some really kind of interesting parallels, almost in reverse,
Right,
between this
right.
story and the Joseph story. These kinds of details are not lost on a lot of commentators. Powell, the book I was quoting before, Mark Powell's book, also notes how Eastern Orthodox commentators, again, Russian Orthodox, love to bring out these kinds of details because of the Joseph story angle, when most Western commentators don't ever mention that parallel. They don't note the Joseph connections. I think that's kind of interesting as well. Now these are the best Bible scholars from the East and West, but they see different things in the story.
Yeah.
Our traditions are different. Fascinating.
Yes.
And I don't know that we make a lot of that, but it is interesting. Jesus' story from 2,000 years ago can have such different ways of looking at it and reading it today in our time. I think one of the things Beth points out is we can never exhaust the meanings. And 5 years from now, we might read the story and out of an entirely new set of circumstances and get new insights about them. That's why Bible study is never old. The stories are old, but the Bible study and learning doesn't have to be old.
Right, and this is going to affect our viewpoint, just like 9/11, like the depression, people live the depression, that affects how they look at issues. 9/11 affects how we looked at issues, living through this virus, and what kind of recession or depression or whatever happens at the end of this is going to affect how we go through this as well.
Yeah, how will this change the church? And what
definitely
church,
a turning point.
What church means for us? Worship, Bible study, just church families in general.
How will we get without hugs?
Yes. We miss them terribly, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of us did not grow up sharing the peace.
That's right.
That's something that kind of happened, or we
On the way.
recovered, at least for Lutherans, sometime in the 1970s.
Right.
And it was objected fiercely by many.
Yes. We're staid Lutherans. We don't do this touchy stuff. We don't share the peace.
Catholics we never did that with
They
Catholics.
stay in your pew and just kind of look at the person next to you, maybe. That was it.
Now we won't be able to share the peace, and we'll miss that.
Yes.
Yeah, not going to happen for quite a while.
Yeah.
When you read these stories, I mean, this analysis is incredible of this one little story.
Of just this one story, right?
Yeah, just this one story, the breakdown of 3 different things. But when as lay people reading a story like this, or any story in the Bible, I mean, we should pay attention to every single word in it, in the story, or?
Well, I would say pay attention to those words that grab you.
Uh-huh.
Read carefully and slowly enough and see where your mind goes, where your heart is drawn. What is the Spirit speaking to you? And don't ever let anybody tell you that you're, you know, you don't have a right to your interpretation of it. You know, now you can be led astray sometimes as well, but where are the details that strike something in your heart or your life or your own life experience? As the word famine does for the Russians, for example. I think that's a powerful example for us. In a way that we read too quickly past some details sometimes, and kind of check our assumptions at the door. We should. That's why slowing down, careful Bible study, reading a text over more than once to see
Yes.
how God is speaking to us.
There's a type of Bible study called Lectio Divina, and the process of that is exactly that. You read it once and just sit with it and don't really, do much with it. And then you read it again, and you can do this alone, or usually it's in a group, but you could certainly do it alone if you wanted. And you just think about what words pop out. Like I said, does famine pop out? Did the prostitute pop out? Did, squander, or whatever words popped out to you, and just kind of then think about maybe why did they pop out, and what words popped out to you, and then read it again, and then keep asking different questions, like what is God doing, where what is God saying for us, and way of kind of picking it apart and looking at different parts of the story. And as we see from today, one of the good questions is, what's the context? What was happening, and why? Maybe why was the story being told? And who were the people he was speaking with? Can give us some clues as to what's going on too.
Love your neighbor.
Good. Love your neighbor comes
Right.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, it's a little after 2. I think let's stop for today. We'll be back together next week at this time, and we'll be looking at Matthew 25 next week. It's another longer parable. 10 young women that Jesus uses to describe the kingdom of God. Matthew 25, 1-13. In the meantime, God bless you with health and protection. Protection from famine, from pandemic, from foolishness, from wastefulness, and protect you with the love of a community and the love of family.
And thanks to Alex Colonna, because I heard that they got a truckload of food after he said
They sure did.
not to worry about my birthday, but give food to the people in the pantry.
That's
So
great.
that was wonderful.
Pretty powerful way to celebrate turning 10 years old.
Right.
Yeah. That's
Run
cool.
a food
Very
drive.
nice.
Yeah.
Very
Good.
nice.
Joyce, thanks for mentioning it. Yeah.
Good point.
Very nice.
Hey, this was fun.
Very good.
God bless you all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.